All right. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone in Europe. Welcome to the Quantitative History webinar series. I'm Zhiwu Chen, Professor of Finance at the University of Hong Kong. I'm also the director of the Asia Global Institute. So today we are really very honored and pleased to have Professor Hans-Joachim Voth, who is a UBS Foundation professor at the Economics Department of the University of Zurich. Previously, he was at UPF in Barcelona, Spain, before he joined the University of Zurich. As many of you know, he is a very well-published authority on economic and financial history, including the long-run economic growth history of many countries and the history of sovereign debt, causes and consequences of the Nazi Party's rise to power, and also the economic history of the Industrial Revolution. So currently, he is one of the managing managing editors of the Economic Journal, and also an associate editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. So he was the editor of Explorations Economic History, as well as of the European Review of Economic History. So today he's going to share with us his joint recent paper, Discretion and Destruction, Promotions, Performance, and Patronage in the Royal Navy. Before I forget, let me also telemarket another webinar he offered to give, that is on November 26th. So in about 2 months, he's going to talk about how not to get published, given that he has been an editor for so many top economics and economic history journals. So he has tons of experience. So especially for our young scholars, who have been joining our webinar series, please remember to mark your calendar and join the special webinar event on November 26th. So before I take too much time away from Joachim, let's all welcome Professor Voth.
Thank you so much, Zhiwu. It's a great pleasure to be here. Of course, your introduction has been much too kind. If I ever have a used car to sell, I'll be asking you to do it. Okay, now we get started with my presentation here. So this is a joint work with Guo Chu, who is at the University of Berkeley. And what we're trying to think about here in this paper is basically selection. We're going to be thinking about selection. How does an organization acquire the people that make key decisions in an organization? Now, for that, two things have to happen. Typically, you need to hire them, and unless you hire them for a very high-level position, you also need to promote them, okay? And we're going to be looking at this in a public sector organization, which in this case happens to be the Royal Navy. So why is that interesting? I think it's interesting for two reasons. First of all, in the last 10 years or so, starting with work by Beasley and Persson, and important contributions by Dalbo and Finan and so forth, I think we have a growing appreciation of how important state capacity is for economic growth and economic outcomes, meaning that a strong, functioning, capable state, on average, is a jolly good thing for productivity, rather than the sort of constrained and rent-seeking vampire squid that in earlier literature instinctively thought all state organizations are. So the key part of having a capable state is getting the right people, getting people who are motivated, capable, competent in order to run the bureaucracy. And there's important work on how to select civil servants with these characteristics, and we'll think about how to do that in our particular setting as well. The second literature that we want to contribute to thinks more generally about the trade-off between discretion on the one hand and rules on the other. And this, as you know, is a very general question in economics. How much should we basically put things on autopilot, and how much should we just use best judgment, given that there's a multiplicity of different inputs and factors that might lead us to the right decision. And you can have that discussion in monetary policy, for example. Standard issue, how much rules-based decision-making do you want versus discretion, but you also have this decision in every HR and every human resource decision. And here, in terms of both hiring and promotion, the trade-off's kind of clear. It could be that if we give discretion to someone, they'll abuse it. They'll just hire their mistress, the wayward son who never gets up out of bed before 12, he needs a job too, you hand it to him. Or it could be that they just use information that's not easy to document, that doesn't necessarily show up in the CV, and they use it to best effect, okay? So in terms of what's good or bad about discretion and hiring, theory is really ambiguous. If you actually look at the literature on whether this is a good or a bad way to do things, you could, depending on how biased people are and how valuable private information might be, you might end up in a good state of the world, meaning if you give discretion to people who make the hiring decision, everything looks wonderful, or it could be very terrible. So in settings like this, where theory gives us a lot of hints, but it doesn't really sort of nail the issue, it's particularly important to look at empirical evidence. And that's what we want to do in this paper. So let me just skip ahead a little bit here. See why I'm not making much progress. What we're going to show in this paper is what we think of as one of the first types of evidence that shows that discretion in promotions can, doesn't necessarily have to, but it can enhance performance. So I'll explain a little bit more in more detail what people have done in this setting, but just as a sort of brief teaser for why we need this paper. Just like with many other papers that look at labor, incentive, HR style issues, I think the problem is that we've been looking too much at the carpet immediately under the lamp when we're looking for the key, okay? Meaning there is a lot of data we can use, but it often comes from settings where performance is easy to measure, and there's a lot of decisions about hiring or promotions, and in such settings, often the job performed tends to be fairly simple, meaning it's typically not sort of high human capital, important leader decision-making, but these tend to be very routine jobs. And there's quite a bit of evidence that discretion is bad, meaning firms sometimes introduce algorithms that give a score to candidates. When a hiring manager deviates from the score, overrides the algo, on average, they tend to be bad. The outcomes tend to be bad. People leave quickly, that's costly. And these are typically settings where people sort of work in fast food restaurants, or they pick fruit and so forth. So if you think about the kind of selection of people that we care about as well, in organizations, it's actually leaders, people who have responsibility for dozens, hundreds, thousands of people. And how to select those, I think there's very, very little evidence. And what we want to do in this paper is to use a unique historical setting to get at this question, to try to understand better what we can say about the value of discretion in selecting people who run a complex little factory, in inverted commas, meaning they're in charge of hundreds of people performing extremely complex tasks. And that setting is the Royal Navy. And we're going to look at the period from 1690 to 1849. It's a very large, very complex military organization. And it's also riddled with what the historians call patronage. And just to clarify this, so there's no ambiguity about this, when you hear patronage, many people sort of hear in the back of their minds that people are already abusing the system, that you just appoint your nephew just because he's your nephew and no other reason. Patronage in the strict sense of the word just means that you have discretion and not rules in appointment to positions in the public service. And in that sense, we're going to use patronage, okay? So what we're going to do with that is to construct the equivalent of a matched manager plant data set. We're going to have 5,800 officers, and they're assigned to 3,900 ships in this period. We're going to identify family ties using genealogical data, and that's going to be our proxy for private information, meaning that you know something extra about a family member on average, as if it's a sort of intention to treat kind of context. And with that, you may or may not be able to make better decisions, or you may show favoritism to a family member. And the beauty of our setting, we think, is that we can actually measure performance, because navies have this beautiful feature that they have one principal purpose, which is to sweep the sea clean of enemy vessels by capturing, burning, or sinking them. And then we're going to use turnover at the very top of the Navy hierarchy to get this variation in the knowledge that the decision maker has about who might be a good guy or a bad guy. I apologize for the politically incorrect use of, I'm not going to use any female form of anything, because there are literally no female officers in the 18th century. Now, the beauty of our setting also is that we observe the choice set. So in almost all modern day HR data, it's very difficult to know where people are selected from. In our setting, and I'll explain exactly in detail why that is, we know 100% of all people who could be promoted. And then we're going to relate these promotion decisions that the Admiralty in London makes to pre-promotion traits and performance, and then see whether in those cases where discretion is used, outcomes, meaning performance of the officer afterwards, is significantly better, or if it's worse than what you would have expected based on all the pre-promotion characteristics that go into it. Okay, so let me start off by giving you an example. We're going to think about a young boy born in 1758, and he's not highborn or particularly rich or elite. He's a son of a country parson, so that's not poverty, but it's sort of middle class, but at best. He joins the Navy age 13, and he's rated a seaman on His Majesty's ship Raisonnable. The captain is an uncle of his. This is how recruitment happens in the Royal Navy. It's completely unsystematic. It's entirely up to the captain to find his crew. So there's no centralized control over this process in any form, shape, or size. The only thing where you have centralized control and hiring decisions and personnel decisions is the thing we're talking about, the promotion that I'll explain in a second in greater detail. So then comes a crucial step in the career of a naval officer, which is to pass for lieutenant. Then you're an officer, even if you only sometimes get to run a ship. And this requires a test in front of a committee. So it's very much like getting your doctorate. And the examination board happens to be chaired by his uncle. Okay. Then at age 21, he's promoted to captain, and he's put in charge of more than 200 men. If you think about the average 21-year-old that you meet today, that thought might make you shudder, especially if you realize that they have to make life and death decisions. So in the meantime, his uncle has become the third naval lord. So the Admiralty is composed of politicians and career captains, and the naval lords are the ones that come from the professional side of the service. He's not at the very top, but he's the third naval lord. Now this man is Horatio Nelson. He gets super fast-tracked through the career, hierarchy of the Royal Navy. And of course, he goes on to win 3 major battles that basically make England into the sea power that it is, a very crucial part on the road to the most, the biggest empire that the world has seen. So this is how these ships look. So this is a typical Royal Navy vessel, a relatively small one. So this is HMS Surprise, and you can see just the distribution here. You have some naval infantry called Marines. You have different categories of sailors, and then you have specialists who typically have been serving on the same ship for a long time, rope makers, armorers, and so forth. And then there's a tiny number of officers, typically 1 or 2 lieutenants, the Marine lieutenant, and the captain. Okay? So that's what the distribution looks like. And despite the story I just told you of how Horatio Nelson made it, the overall evidence seems to be that the Royal Navy does things pretty well. So it on average outfights its rivals. If you just total up the number of ships sunk, then typically it does better on a ratio of 7-to-1, 10-to-1, depending on how you run the numbers. So here's what professional historians have said about this. And they say, we are mistaken to suppose that a system based on personal influence must necessarily have chosen unworthy men. This would have been so if the person with the power of choice had placed other qualities above professional ability. For example, choosing officers only from noble blood, as the French Navy normally did. A system of patronage to identify and advance men of ability might be at least as efficient as any examination or any report in bringing skillful officers to the head of the profession. Okay? That's what they say, and this is what we're trying to prove. This is what we're trying to show you with rigorous data analysis, that a system of patronage in this setting, using discretion in making a key promotion decision, ends up picking men of greater ability than any other system could have done, plausibly. Okay, so there's a lot of work on the Navy. Many of the papers are very interesting. They think through incentives. You have work on the prize system, where officers are basically paid for capturing enemy ships. They show that some of the outperformance of the Royal Navy in part is a result of its fighting experience. And what we're going to just do is look at just one thing: discretion in selection. Okay? So let me give you a little bit of context and background. So this is what a career looks like for an officer. Okay? Officers only. You need to be a lieutenant. This is the pool from which captains can be chosen. And some of those lieutenants are given small ships, in which case they're called commander. Okay? But they're still lieutenants. And when you're a lieutenant and a commander, your employment is kind of tenuous, meaning there isn't much of a commitment to really find you a ship. You end up being on the beach quite often. And only if you're given a small ship do you have full control over a ship's crew. The crucial step in the life of a Navy officer is to be made what they call post-captain. And this is really the equivalent of tenure in an academic setting, which means that from there on, you're on a conveyor belt to become admiral. Everything is seniority based. You basically have your pick of ships, or you're continuously employed. And you become a post-captain by being put in charge of a large ship with at least 20 guns, what they call a sixth-rate ship. That will be a frigate. And then you serve your way up, typically to bigger frigates, and then to small battleships, and then to large battleships, okay? And if you get promoted early enough to post-captain and you manage to live, which most of them do, then it's more or less certain that you're going to be an admiral at some point. And then there's different levels of it, and you can sort of work your way through the system all the way up to Admiral of the Red, which is the captain of the home fleet, and the second highest rank in the Royal Navy, just one step below the First Lord of the Admiralty. Okay, so let's think about this. The Admiralty promotes from a large pool of candidates. So in an average year that we're looking at, we have 112 candidates, meaning lieutenants who could be promoted and there's just 18 spots, okay? So it's even worse than the job market for economists. And there's a clear monitoring constraint. Once you're given command of a ship, officers have enormous discretion, and there's no centralized control. There's no radio. Many of the letters take 6 months to arrive. So in terms of having to be able to trust someone to do the right thing, this is like an incredibly important aspect of the setting. And post-promotion, the incentives are kind of weak. So while everybody wants to make money and capturing enemy ships makes you some money, there's very little you can do to a post-captain, okay? So that's why we think that selection to post-captain is the critical screening stage. If you want to understand why British officers on average seem to be outfighting their enemies, this is the thing that you have to understand, okay? So this is how we're going to think about this. This is the conceptual framework. We have officers, and we're going to think of 3 time periods. At time 0, everybody's a lieutenant. At time 1, people could be a post-captain. By time 2, they're all going to be post-captains. I'm going to explain that in a minute. Sooner or later, eventually, almost all lieutenants make it. Some of them take an awfully long time. But the key dimension in which discretion and patronage operates here is to fast-track people. So think of the Nelson example again. That is the example of fast-tracking someone. If you make them a post-captain age 21, they will be in senior command sooner or later conducting major battles, okay? So at time, if you're a junior, you're a lieutenant, and we're gonna index that with J equals 0, or you're senior, and then you're a captain with J equals 1. Everybody's senior by time 2, okay? And then performance is a result of time fixed effects, tau t, some random shocks, epsilon, and we're going to have theta. And theta is your officer's ability, okay? And that's a combination of your ability in time 1, when you're a lieutenant, when you might be given a small ship, and in time periods 1 and 2, when you're given a large ship, possibly. So the Admiralty promotes from the subset of officers early at time equals 1. And we're just going to assume that whatever random shock there is in expectation is 0. Okay? Now, the Admiralty will hold private information over a subset of candidates. And this is what we call the connected people. And they're going to be connected through family links, some of them relatively remote. Okay? So we're going to assume that the Admiralty promotes officers to maximize the performance once they're given a big ship and private benefits. So the utility expected is a function of these 2 things. Y is the output they produce, which in this case is to sink, capture, or burn enemy ships. And with weight alpha, it also depends on the utility that the admiral gets from promoting a relative. So that's just sheer favoritism, you know. Young James, the second daughter of my cousin, happens to be promoted. I get some warm glow. I might get a pat on the back at the family reunion. All of these things will go into that decision. And if the value of the expected utility is high enough, I will press the button and make that decision. Okay? So this is a typical prediction problem, of course. You have some information, but what you're really interested in is something that you don't observe, which is how these guys are going to do going forward, okay? And the problem here is that the private information might help in making that prediction, but it also creates the space, the potential for the admiral to abuse the system and use the discretion that they have to reap this private benefit alpha, promoting connected people. Okay, so how we're going to apply this? We collect data from a fantastic website called 3dex.com. I'm skeptical about anything on the internet, so we contacted the Royal Naval Observatory in Greenwich and asked them what the best source of data for the Navy in the 18th century was, and they said it's 3dex.com. They have exploited everything. It's a collaborative effort like Wikipedia, but they've exploited every printed source and then gone to the archives to clarify things and so forth. So we have the records of the ships and the service records from 3 decks, and we augmented with additional data on officers and ship histories. This is what the data looks like. We have these 5,800 officers on these 3,800 ships, of which 640 are major battleships. And in this period, the Royal Navy captures 6,000 enemy ships. Okay. On average, our officers serve for 12 years, and they're in command of a ship for 6. They typically get to command about 3 ships, and 18% of the time they're in charge of a ship of the line. The average ship that they have has 32 guns, and they capture 1 enemy ship, and they also sink a small share. Okay, of the people that we see, half are made post, and 3% make it to admiral. So 3% of observations come from people who are admirals. Many more of them make it to admiral in the end. How are we going to measure connections? So we use this genealogical data set that Guo has exploited for his job market paper 2 called the peerage. And there we can match on name and date of birth for blood relations. And the admirals are easy to track because they've often been made members of the nobility, even if they are lowly born. And in addition, we can trace 11% of captains. So we're going to call someone connected if there's less than 16 degrees of separation. And that's the top 20% in terms of connections in the peerage data set. And what we assume is that missing individuals, people that we can't trace in the peerage, are simply not connected. Okay? And we're only going to look at family ties to the apex of the Royal Navy, meaning you're either connected to the admiral of the fleet or the first lord of the admiralty. And that's just for data availability reasons. Okay? So here's an example. Think of George Augustus Elliot, who actually gets to command one of the first sort of steam-powered, screw-driven ships of the Royal Navy. He's the son of George Elliot, who is the brother of Gilbert Elliot Murray, the second Earl of Minto. Okay, so his uncle is the first Lord of the Admiralty from 1835 onwards, and he promotes young George Augustus Elliot to post-captain. That's in this case not that many degrees of separation, but that's exactly the kind of thing that we will be looking at. So we're going to measure performance by enemy ships captured and sunk. We're not going to look at prize money, partly because the data is limited. All these stakes, all these outcomes are high stakes, meaning captains can and do lose their lives in the pursuit of enemy ships. And we'll just take one simple measure. We combine captures and ships sunk on the left-hand side and call that performance. Okay. Now, the good thing about our setting, of course, is from 1690 to 1850, Britain fights a lot of wars. About 1 year out of 3, there's a war underway. And here you see the number of fighting events, any Royal Navy ship engaging an enemy. And in our best years, in inverted commas, you have more than 300 events in a single year. Okay, so plenty of variation, plenty of outcomes to look at. Okay, so how does promotion here work? So think of the following setup. At the bottom, you have in this large bubble all lieutenants. Some of them are on half pay, meaning they're not active. The blue ones are all active. And then from the blue set, there's some who are connected, indicated by a star. And out of these, some will be picked for promotion. And then they go to the post-captain pool. Again, some of them will not be active. They're going to be on half pay. Some of them are connected. Some of them are not connected. And as the people at the top of the naval hierarchy change, different people will have a connection. And what we're basically going to do is to say, okay, in this year, this lieutenant happens to be connected to the admiral at the top of the naval hierarchy. If the admiral now picks him, is he going to do particularly well in the future, in the N years he has to make a mark and sink enemy ships? If he's passed over and he's connected, meaning somebody looks at him, knows him, is connected to him, but says, he's just no good. We'll just leave him in the pool, let somebody else deal with him. We will call him passed over, and we expect that he will do less well. Okay, and we can do that for the unconnected as well. See who gets promoted, see who gets not promoted, thrown back in the pool, some of which will eventually make it, and then we see their performance. Okay, so in any 1 year, we're going to have pre-promotion characteristics of those promoted, and we're going to compare them with those passed over, thrown back into the lieutenant's pool. Okay, so what does that look like? So here's our data at the choice year level. And on average, as I said, we have 112 officers and 18 promotions. And these people already have some victories, meaning they were in command of a small vessel. They have some years of experience. Their share of them has ties to the elite in general, and some of them have direct ties to the top of the admiralty. So we just look at them, the people who are promoted compared to the ones that are not promoted. Here is how it looks. So on average, these people coming up for tenure, if you will, they have 0.18 victories, meaning something like 1 out of 6 maybe has captured an enemy ship. But the ones promoted have a markedly higher rate, 1 out of 4. On average, they have 10 years of tenure. The promoted ones have a little bit more tenure. So that's the entire time in the Navy. The years in command is 0.17. And for the promoted ones, it's 0.876. So it's just a little bit more. The promoted ones have a little bit more of an elite connection. They're more likely to come from naval families. And there's a benefit from being connected, meaning connected people on average get promoted earlier. Let me show you briefly what results look like as a function of tenure. Okay, so you have this pool of lieutenants. Let's call that 1. Initialize, just index to 1 at the start. And then as they get promoted to post captain, they leave the sample. And now we're going to compare high performance versus low performance officers, lieutenants. And we're going to do that for connected and unconnected ones. Okay, and then in the combination of these two, you will see how valuable it is to be connected for promotion and how valuable it is to be high performance. So just look at the light gray lines first. The top line is if you're unconnected and you don't perform, meaning on average you have no captures, then even after 25 years, only a quarter of these lieutenants will have been made post-captain. Okay. Now, if you're unconnected and you perform well, then already after 15 years or so, a quarter will be promoted, and at the 25-year mark, half of them will be post-captains. So, since they often start their service life age 10 or so, they're not that old. They're 35 or something like that when they're given a ship. Now, everything is shifted downwards for the connected. So you can see the solid black lines here. This is for the connected. And these are the connected guys here, the top curve. These are the connected guys with low performance. And they're treated about as well in terms of promotion prospects as the unconnected high performance guys. And then there's an additional effect from being connected and high performance. And these people really get fast tracked for promotion. So fully half of them with 15 years of tenure are already post-captains. And by the 20-year mark, about 75% of them have been promoted. Okay? So promotion decisions clearly look at both things. Being connected on average helps you get an earlier start to the major step up in the career ladder. But on top of that, performance counts. The things that you do as a lieutenant really shift the probability of getting promoted. So this is just showing you the same thing, basically with a connection interaction. So if you get promoted by having more victories, or you have more victories if you're promoted. But if you're connected and you're promoted out of this annual pool, then you have particularly high numbers of victories. Okay, so let's look at performance. That's the heart of our analysis and the heart of the paper. Do these guys actually do better if they've been promoted as a result of this fleeting temporary connection to the very top of the Navy hierarchy in that moment? Is it favoritism? Then their performance should be bad. Or is it actually private information that the admiral is selecting the right people and throwing back, including connected people that they know and think are no good, and raising average performance as a result? So what we want to see is whether we know that promotion is merit-based, and it's more merit-based for connected subordinates, but we want to see whether this actually translates into better post-promotion performance. And that's not obvious. We all know about the Peter principle. There's some evidence from other settings where salesmen are promoted to become managers. If they're a particularly good salesman, that normally doesn't work. So it's not obvious that there's a lot of useful information in the kind of stuff that goes into the promotion decision. Okay, so what we want to know is basically what is the selection effect that we're going to call tau 1 here, and we're going to try to figure out what is the effect from selecting someone, what is their expected performance in terms of destruction compared to if we don't promote them. Now, the first thing we observe, we promote someone and they go on to capture, sink, and burn enemy ships. The second one we don't see directly, and here's the trick that we're going to use to get around this issue. So we will look at their eventual performance. Most of these, as you saw, sooner or later do get a ship. They do get promoted. And what we're going to do is to say the performance that we then see once they get a ship is the performance that we could have gotten out of them if we promoted them now. Okay? So to give you an illustration of this, think about the following setting. We have 4 officers. Let's call the choice here 1700. So in 1700, we observe this pool of people, on average 118. So we're going to have people who are connected and unconnected, and we have people who are promoted and those that are passed over. Okay? So what are we going to do? Well, for the promoted, it's easy. 1700 is the choice here, and then in 1701, this guy here, for example, has 3 enemy captures. So that's what we're going to call their performance. Now, for Officer B, it's harder. In 1700, he's not promoted, but he's connected. A relative looked at him and said, no good, he's not going to make it. So he doesn't get promoted in 1700. He doesn't get promoted in 1701. Maybe he's promoted in 1702. And then in the next 3 years, he has 1 capture. So what we're going to do is, in the counterfactual that we calculate, to just forget about the years 1700, 1701, 1702, when he doesn't have a ship, and just basically cut and paste in his performance once he's been promoted, 1702, 1703, 1704. And of course, we have to take great care to make sure that the external conditions, how much warfare is there, how many enemy ships does the Navy capture on average, that they're all comparable compared to what we see here, okay? And then we just do exactly the same thing for the unconnected. Now, this is sort of the heart of our empirical strategy. We're basically trying to conjure up out of what we think is a little bit more than thin air, counterfactual performance for people who haven't been promoted by using their future performance. Now, you may think that this is problematic, and I would agree with you that this is not bulletproof, but like with many decisions, like the junior colleague you don't tenure, it's kind of hard to see how they will do. They go to a different university, now they do badly, maybe they have fewer conditions, fewer resources, less good colleagues. Can you really use it as a prediction of how they would have done if you'd promoted them? Well, there may be a shift, but what we're going to argue and going to show you some evidence of is that what's crucial for our purposes is that whatever mistake we make, whatever bias there is from doing this cut and paste substitution to get the counterfactual, that is not affecting the level differences here between connected and unconnected guys. Meaning that whatever bias we generate from looking at this particular counterfactual is not affected differentially by connected or unconnected status of the officer. As long as you believe that, as long as you think that our cut and paste shortcut is not biased, we should be fine, okay? So that's what we do here. So you could think maybe people get just dispirited, you know, if they are being passed over, maybe they just do badly. Maybe that's true. Here we have the difference between connected and unconnected as a function of the year when you're passed over. In year 0, somebody looks at you and says, no good. Difference between connected and unconnected guys thrown back in the pool. And as you can see, it's statistically indistinguishable from 0. So we don't worry about that. Okay, so let me show you what the results look like. Now we're going to just run a diff and diff with your performance in the years after promotion as a function of whether you are connected, whether you're promoted immediately, meaning you're not passed over, plus a bunch of time-fixed effects and other controls. Okay, so this is the core result of the paper. This is the victories per year that you will have, and notice how many observations we have, because the same officer can be in the pool time and again, and we adjust for that by clustering and so forth. On average, the people who are promoted have more victories, unsurprising. So average promotion picks people who are better than the people who are left in the pool, passed over, whatever you want to call it. That's robust to including interactions of choice year and post-promotion year fixed effects. You can throw in controls for wars. That's always true. And then we say, okay, let's distinguish this effect for the group of people who are connected at the time of promotion and the ones who are not connected at time of promotion. And this entire effect, picking the right people, the promoted officers going on to outperform, comes from the connected guys. Okay, so there's no level effect of being connected, but if you're connected and promoted, if a relative of yours chooses you in the year that you enter the pool, and are eligible for promotion, if that's true, then on average, you will outperform, and you outperform by about a quarter of baseline performance. So that's huge. It's a very big effect. And as we control for extra stuff, this effect doesn't get smaller. If anything, it becomes a little bit bigger. Then, of course, there's two things into actually performing here, sinking enemy ships. One is that you do a good job when you're in command. The other one is that you're actually around to command, meaning you don't have other things to do when nobody decides that you're not the right type and doesn't give you a ship. So if we just restrict ourselves to the set of people who are actually in command of ships, then of course the average capture rate rises to about 0.2, one ship every 5 years. And in line, the interaction effect of promoted and connected also increases substantially. And the more we control for stuff like ship fixed effects and so forth, if we worry that the connected people get nicer ships, the effect becomes bigger, meaning people just do extraordinarily well. Sorry, the effect becomes a tiny bit smaller. The people do extraordinarily well, and we cannot explain it away, if they were promoted by a relative. So what that seems to say is that whatever incentive for bias the admiral may have in favoring a relative is completely outdone, compensated for, by selecting the right people as a result of private information. So here you can actually see the performance difference between officers who are promoted versus officers who are passed over. And you can see how for the unconnected, there is a difference, but it's really quite small, meaning that on average, the admirals pick the right officers from the unconnected, but they're not terribly good at doing that. What they're really good at is for the connected guys to pick who should get a ship and who shouldn't. And there you see a much bigger performance difference and it actually becomes bigger over time, meaning that it's not just that you know that these are going to be better officers on average, but as they become more senior, are given more important commands, they continue to outperform on a huge scale. Okay? So we're going to look a little bit more closely at capture events. And here we're going to go just for a subset of the data, what they call single ship actions. Many captures happen in sort of messy circumstances. Sometimes you have naval battles. At the Battle of Trafalgar, you have quite a few French and Spanish ships being captured, but of course it's not clear whether that should just be attributed to the captain doing it or whether it's the other ships around him and the naval genius of Nelson and so forth. But with single ship actions, it's kind of clean. These are random meetings, typically of two ships on the high seas. So here's a famous example. This is USS Constitution fighting HMS Java in the War of 1812, and much to the shock and surprise of the British, the Americans actually win. And that's particularly shocking to them because this is considered a fair contest and they are used to the idea of winning all the time. So the nice thing about these settings is that we know everything about them. They're incredibly well documented. So here you have, for this particular ship duel, every last thing that happens when, where, and how by the minute, okay? So what we've done here is to look at the few hundred cases of single ship duels that we have. And of course, having a bigger ship, having more guns helps you win, okay? So what does this show? This is looking at the gun ratio, where you have a gun ratio of 0.5 if the British ship has exactly as many guns as the enemy ship. And for the left, you see captains who were promoted by a relative at the Admiralty. And on the right-hand side, you see outcomes for captains who are unconnected to the Admiralty. What's the probability of capturing the enemy? Well, if you have an even gun ratio, meaning both ships are equally strong, then for the unconnected already, the chance of winning is about 90%, more than 90%. For the connected, it's almost 100%. And this is something that you see in all these naval engagements time and again. The British are just better. So with ships of equal force, because they're better sailors, they have more experience, they have the crews trained to a much higher level. On average, they win, which is what makes the HMS Java losing to USS Constitution such a shock to the system. The other thing that you see here is that there's a distinct difference between the connected and unconnected officers. The promoted by relative connected officers, the solid line up here, basically says that even if they're outgunned 4-1, they still win 70% of the time. And as that gun ratio goes to 3-1 or 2-1, they basically always win. That's not true of the unconnected officers. The people who are promoted, meaning they're promoted quickly as they come up, if they're outgunned 5-1, they lose. If they're outgunned 3-1, you get closer to an even chance. There isn't much of a difference between those who are passed over and those who are connected to the Admiralty, so those who are promoted immediately and passed over if they're unconnected to the Admiralty, which is telling us that the value here of selection is quite small. These two curves are almost identical in this very clean setting. Here, the difference between these two lines is enormous. What's that saying? That's saying that if a relative of yours sits in London, gets your CV and says, just the right man for the job, we'll promote straight away, you're going to be one of these guys here. You lose, you hardly ever lose. You almost win, even in completely desperate circumstances. If that relative of yours looks at your package and says, oh my God, he's not going to be good, then on average, you will do much worse. You'll do about as well as these guys here, but no better. So what's that saying? That's saying that selection here really works, but it only works for people that, where we have some indirect evidence that you might be well known to the Admiralty. And keeping out the bad guys is just as important as finding the winners. Both of these things clearly go into making selection work, which in this case means that patronage works, and some of it works through family links. Okay? So we can try to throw in observable pre-promotion differences, and they don't really do the job. So this is basically an exercise in futility, meaning the interaction coefficient here that shows that selection is positive for the connected people. You can't make it go away by having capture fixed effects pre-promotion, by how much tenure and command experience you have pre-promotion, by the number of elite links. And then we do this beautiful, simple thing called constant exact matching, which is a spirited way of throwing away data until every person who is connected looks in terms of pre-promotion characteristics just like somebody who is unconnected. And if you do that, the treatment effect here, or the difference between those connected and promoted and those connected and not promoted, becomes bigger. Okay, that's what the CM result seems to suggest. Okay, so if you look at performance around promotion by early versus late promotion, and you look at that for the connected and unconnected, then that's sort of in line with what you saw before. It's for the people who are connected at time 0 that performance after promotion really picks up. It's not that they're on average that much better when they come up for promotion. It's once you give them a ship, you really start to outperform, whereas the unconnected guys, they sort of afterwards do more or less what they were doing before. Okay? So we want to think more about, is it keeping out the wrong people or is it fast tracking the right guys? Okay, it's an important connection. So what's really driving this extra capture rate? And what we can do is to have an alternative promotion rule in the back of our minds and say, if we just followed a merit-based rule, just promote always the people with the highest number of captures that come up for possible promotion. What's the number of victories that they would get? And how much of an increase do we see in the people who are actually promoted in comparison? And if we follow a merit-based rule, that would give us pretty good officers. But on top of that, the fast tracking of connected people will still give you an extra performance kick. Okay? That's what we're trying to show here. So we're going to estimate here with a bunch of different promotion rules, looking at average performance. And we're going to have a pure favoritism rule, just see if you always if you always promoted connected subordinates, how would average performance look? What would performance look like if we have strict seniority? And what would it look like if we go for strict merit? And then compare it with our actual performance. And we need to do this a couple of times because we're going to need to break ties based on these rules. So we're going to do it 1,000 times. Okay? So if you just promote it at random, unsurprisingly, you would get a distribution centered on 0. Okay? Now, if I instead only promote the connected, that would already be better. The connected on average make better officers. If I just promote by strict seniority, it's going to be terrible. Selection will be negative, meaning I would actually weaken the performance of the officers if I just went with the people who have the highest tenure at the time of promotion. And by strict merit, this is what I would get. Okay, so if I just rank people by how many enemy captures they have, I would end up with this. And the line that you see is the selection effect that we estimate for the actual process that they run. Meaning that there's no way any of these other rules would have given us selection as good as what we have. Strict merit on average would still underperform, but only by a bit. And it could be that it might be as good or a little bit better. Okay. Here's something extra that we did. We said, let's imagine that the Royal Navy has a supercomputer in its basement in 1700, and they feed it with all the data that they have of what makes a good officer. Okay, and then we do a random forest prediction exercise, which is about the most efficient way of making a prediction that you can. And if they'd done that, then you would have ended up with this gray line here to the right, that would dominate merit, it would dominate the actual selection that we see. But of course, it's also completely unrealistic because nobody has that data at this point in time. So we can engineer a selection rule that would have done a little bit better. How much better would it have done? Well, you know, if you think of this is 0.01 here, this is 0.015, it would have done maybe 50% better. But that just gives you a sense, we think, and how totally awesome the actual selection by the Navy and the 19th century and the 18th century was. Okay, so what's the aggregate gain? How much better do they do? So if we compare the rule that they follow with random promotion, then this means that they captured an extra 407 enemy ships. That's 10% of all captures. So by using information efficiently, by promoting people that you know, and using the selection margin aggressively because the Admiralty has discretion and can use this private information, they up their capture rate by about 10%, which we think is pretty important. Okay, so let me conclude. Patronage, you hear it and you already run for the hills. People think that's got to be bad. But then if you look at the world around us, the way we hire people, the way we sell our graduate students, we know that objective measures of performance are only one small way to predict how they're going to do. And there are people who come up for tenure with no publications, get tenure, and go on to win the Nobel Prize. And that's a little bit the setting that we investigate here, which we think is a good metaphor for many settings. We find a very positive effect of discretion in the crucial promotion step in the Royal Navy. We think of this as an existence result, consistent with better information. And we think that there's implications for organizational design. Because ex-post performance is so hard to predict, and aligning incentives is often tricky and selection can be very costly, in many settings when it comes to selecting people who make important decisions, highly complex, demanding tasks and jobs, there's good use to be made from private information. And the key question is, how much does this, can you scale this? And what is the external validity of the findings that we have for our particular setting? And I think I should leave it there, no? Thank you.
Thank you, Joachim. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Chicheng, Professor Chicheng, to moderate the discussion and Q&A, I just have one quick question, Joachim. That is, you nicely quoted Roger, basically saying that the French Navy would select office or would do promotion based on noble blood, but the English Navy was doing it differently. So in your sample, I assume some of the connected ones may have the noble blood background based on the genealogy information. So would that subgroup do better in terms of winning battles and capturing more ships and so on? Have you tried that?
Okay, great question. So I think what you're thinking is maybe the blue-blooded are just always different and they're also more likely to be connected, right? And there's only so much we can do with that because, as you know, the English aristocracy is incredibly tiny, right? So everything goes to the first son. So basically almost nobody's noble. Some of these officers become noble because they do so well and they are given an earldom or something, as Nelson is. If we actually take noblemen, they're no better than the rest, okay, in terms of performance. Or they're largely indistinguishable. We can control for it. We have another thing that we do, which is general connections to the elite, meaning how many of your relatives have high status, MPs, etc. None of that makes you better, okay? You're a little bit better if you're part of a naval family. So if you're a father, brother, uncle, who are in the Royal Navy, those on average tend to be a little bit better. but they're not more likely to be connected to the apex of the naval hierarchy.
Because I guess for the blue blood descendants, then they would not, I mean, there would not be any decision involved. They would be automatically given commander posts. So anyway, so it should be interesting. I understand the sample may be too limited. Yeah. Okay, Chicheng.
Okay, thank you, Professor Voth. Now I will moderate our discussion part. We are very happy to have Professor Jin Li, the Professor of Strategy and Economics in Hong Kong University, as our invited discussant. And after that, we will turn to the Q&A question to answer some questions from the audience. So, Professor Li.
Thanks, Chicheng. Thanks, Zhiwu, and thanks, Joachim, for a wonderful presentation. And Zhiwu, actually, I would thank you in particular for having me discuss this paper. It's an absolute joy to read the paper and listen to the presentation. This is, in my opinion, that one of the greatest empirical org paper in recent years, and it's with good chance, I would say, it's heading to another top 5 journal. But I guess, my job, I mean, it's easy to make such claim, but I think these claims are based in part, this paper talks about a very important topic. You mentioned its state capacity to start with. I do a little bit management and strategy. This is what we will call dynamic capability. In a sense that, selection is truly important, not just for countries, but for firms as well. Let me add something on the side is, as an organizational economist, some of us actually read this funny little book. It's called Parkinson's Law. I see it. Mm-hmm. The Parkinson's Law is actually, it's kind of a collection of stories about administrative inefficiencies. And one of the chapter is about selection. And most of the book, actually, a lot of it is about stories in British Navy. And when they talk about selection, let me just read, it says, past method, not entirely disused, fall into 2 main categories, the British and the Chinese. Basically, they're saying the British is the patronage system, where the Chinese, we know from Chicheng and many other people's work, is by examinations. That's how selection is done. I'm not going to argue which one is better, but in the case of Navy battles, it's fairly clear. In fact, I think today is a fairly special day. It's probably 125 years after China actually lost to Japan in the very famous, we call it the kind of the Zhiwu Haizhan. So, you know what happens, if you just take 2 data points on the Navy battle, which selection system might be better. But that's just something aside. And I guess my job is not entirely to sing songs about how great the paper is about. Let me now come to the more substantive comments. And hearing this, I'm just jogging it down while I listen to the talk. I have essentially 5 comments, and I'll try to be fast in each of them. The first comment has to do with connecting the model to the data. Okay, one of the model it's a very standard model about private, private information and private benefits, standard trade-off. But one special feature in this context, and I wish you could emphasize a little bit more, is that the private benefit of the admirals may actually depend on the type of the relatives, let's say, they have. Right? Normally, you would actually always want to promote someone, except in this context, if you know your nephew is not very good, yet you ask him to be promoted to be a captain, the chances is that maybe in family gathering, and if your relatives say, okay, why do you actually send my son to death? So this is a model in which the private benefit may quite depend on the type of the private information, on the type of the individual. Essentially, so I don't think that's going to change your result in any way, but it may be useful to have a more general model and then link it to data comparing between peacetime and wartime. Right, so maybe kind of in a relatively more peaceful time, you just want to get your relative promoted. Mm-hmm. And then when it is a wartime, you want to get him promoted only if he is good. In fact, I was mentioning kind of British Chinese, in Chinese history, there's this famous story of the War of Changping. The basic idea is that a guy called Zhao Kuo, he was actually asked to lead a big army to fight the country of Qing. Yet after hearing the story, his mother actually told the emperor, the king, don't promote my son. He's going to be a disaster. So that's actually a fairly famous story in the Chinese history. And this is a story that if I know my son is good, not so good, maybe I don't want him to get promoted. So that is the part I think, it's not going to go against your basic story, but it can add a little bit more richness to it. Maybe be able to see different effect between peacetime and wartime. So that's point number one about linking the model to the data. The second has to do with measurement. Okay, so I actually applaud you guys to tackle so many potential measurement issues, because in this study, it's not one of those even simple production function like playing baseball, right? Here, this production is team-based. You are laden with measurement problems. What's the equipment you get? Do you get the right assignment? And I think you guys have done a fantastic job dealing with all of it. In fact, the best evidence I saw is coming from this single ship duel. I think that's actually the best. But even there, if you could, for example, control for the quality of the opponent, maybe you have already done it, but I haven't seen it, is that, perhaps, you could argue one selection problem that arises that I'm connected, I'm going to more likely to be in area that the weaker the opponent might show up. Right, so you can show that, maybe kind of, I don't know, back then the Spanish is always better than Americans, right? So, control for the quality of the opponent, that can be actually kind of one way to make your story even more convincing. So that's a second point on measurement. The third point has to do with learning. So I think one of the results, I must say I find rather surprising in the paper, is that if you're not connected, then really your performance really doesn't depend that much on whether you are early promoted or late promoted. So that is very strong. So there is a difference for the connected one, but for the unconnected one, the timing of promotion seems to have no effect on post-performance. And one answer to that is maybe that the signal we get is just all noise, so maybe there's no information on the timing. But if that is true, perhaps you can also run a regression looking at the previous performance on post-performance to see truly this effect is random or not. Mm-hmm. So that's the part on learning. Frankly, I would say I'm slightly surprised by this result, but this is really a cool result that timing of promotions does not affect the performance of the unconnected. So that's the third part about learning, and the fourth comment is about mechanism. Okay, so kind of why are these people better? Broadly speaking, in the model is that they have a higher theta, maybe the ability is higher. But one thing I wish you could add a bit more and have more discussion on is motivation. Okay? So again, coming to this kind of a single ship duel example, okay? It may well be the case that if I'm connected and I win, I'm more likely to have a more glorious future than if I'm not connected. That is going to affect the incentive I fight. That's going to affect the incentive whether I'm going to engage the battle in the first place. And also that's going to affect, if you think not just at the individual level, but at the fleet level. So maybe those connected ones are more individualistic. The other ones, they're more likely to cooperate with other ships. So if you actually have some data to look at the performance of the fleet, control for the fraction of the captains who are connected, and to see that, out of a fleet, do you benefit from a higher fraction of captains who are connected. So that's going to capture some externality effect, because in a war, it's not just single ship against single ship. You need cooperation, you need all kinds of things. So that's the mechanism. So that's the fourth point. And then the fifth point is about, is about the motivation. You motivated the paper quite a bit early on about discretion and the selection. And in the discussion, and maybe also in the paper, I haven't seen enough institutional detail talking about the discretion. Maybe there is you talk about fast track versus filtering in some sense, but maybe a little bit more discussion on truly the role of the admiral, how these people are selected. Just for me, it'd be more useful to see how promotion actually happens. I said I have 5, but then talking about it, there's one more point, which is the promotion rule. Now you have a bunch of promotion rule at the end, which actually I think is great because that gives us some quantitative sense about how important it is. But also, I would just add, I think this is maybe a little bit related to my own work, is sometimes the optimal promotion rule may be a combination of seniority and a random assignment. So maybe you want to start with seniority and later on you do it then. So that's, that's just kind of additional thing. But that I'm taking out a lot of time, so I'm going to just stop here. Again, fantastic paper.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lee. So Professor Voth, can you do some response now?
Excellent. Thank you so much. Those are wonderful comments. Really appreciate it. Let me try to do my best to answer these points. So clearly some of them require further thought than I can come up with off the cuff right now. So the first point you made is maybe the private benefit of promoting a relative really depends on their type. Do you want a bad relative to be given command of a ship if all they do is go out and kill themselves? And I think the answer we sort of know empirically. First of all, the rates of death for British captains are kind of low. Do they depend on whether they're good or bad? I'm not quite sure. There's a lot of randomness in this, right? I mean, what does a captain do? What is their job other than training, selecting the crew and so forth? In a naval battle, they stand on the quarterdeck. That's the open part on the back of the ship. And while the cannonballs fly, they basically have to stand there unmoved and basically tell their men to carry on. That is their only job they have. And, that's where you can get killed, like Nelson. And if you sort of think about an extreme example of somebody trying to get his relatives promoted. There's a famous captain called Sir Pellew, who makes admiral. He's a frigate captain in the Napoleonic Wars, and he gets a peerage and everything else. And he has sons in the Navy. And whatever success he has, as soon as there's another good thing he's done, he writes to the Admiralty and says, promote my sons. Now is the time, they should be given this, and they should be made lieutenant and frigates and everything else. And his sons are overwhelmingly bad. There's nothing that he passed on in his ability or whatever to these guys. And the Admiralty is very reluctant, but eventually they sort of do it. They don't get killed. So, he knows this business as much as anyone. And even for somebody who's sort of been smelling the gunpowder every day, it's pretty clear that his sons who are not amazing, they should be promoted. So I see the logic of what you say, it's just not there in the empirics, I think, if you go to cases where you can look. The second point you made is measurement. Of course, this is a team-based outcome. We try to do our best to control for everything. So, we have data on the ships. We know how good they are. We know when they were not just built, but we know whether we have ship fixed effects, right? Because captains turn over, so we know whether these are good ships and bad ships on average capturing more enemies. We control for crew fixed effects because these crews serve for a long time on the same ship, but of course a good crew is worth a lot. There's still something left. The thing that you suggest is the quality of the opponent. So I like the idea of throwing in a French dummy or a Spanish dummy and just see what comes out. We may have even a little bit of extra data because the 3DEX data is so rich. So we could maybe even try to get a fix on the quality of the enemy captain. And if we can do that, I think you're perfectly right in saying that that's a step up. So The other point you made is mechanism. Maybe what we're picking up are just sort of egomaniac guys who always want to get max credit, and they're just very bad team players, right? So we can all think we think that investment banking, for example, you have that problem, right? That ultimately the firm profits might be damaged by somebody just going all out, enhancing their bonus. So what can we say about this? And I think the single ship actions speak a little bit to that, but you're perfectly right in saying there's a deeper question here about fleet performance and so forth. I think the technology required to answer that question well basically requires a different paper, right? So because this is like the sort of value-added exercises that we have from teachers in classrooms, where you sort of want to combine everything with everything else to get a sense of what are the individual fixed effects in the, including in fleet actions and so forth, of which there are not that many. And until Nelson comes along, they're mostly indecisive, right? That's one of the big dirty secrets of naval warfare in the 18th century, that they spent this incredible amount of money having these ships sail back and forth, and most of the time nothing happens. And even when the fleets meet, you know, there isn't that much amazing action. And that is sort of the innovation of Nelson to really have battles with a clear outcome on the sea. So I'm totally with you that that would be wonderful, but I do think it would lead us a little bit far. You said you want more evidence on how they actually make decisions, and I think that's a great suggestion. We should just go and get a little bit more institutional nitty-gritty. I'm always worried, since I'm sort of more of a historian myself, that you weigh down the paper with all this sort of specificity and detail, and then the next cold-eyed referee comes along and says, no external validity, you know, who cares about these guys in the 18th century? But just a touch of extra flavor, I think that's the spirit of your comment, might go a long way. I'm also sympathetic to the idea that maybe the right standard for promotion rules might be a combination of different things, and that's where we're sort of trying to go with the random forest, right? That's what the random forest does. It basically looks at every possible combination of different rules and cutoffs, and then goes through this a few hundred times, and then does this thing of predicting out of sample and resampling again. And basically it's the best you can do as a prediction exercise based on combining all these things like seniority, pre-performance, and so forth. And I think I've covered everything. No?
Essentially everything, yes. I think that the learning effect there is the part that I'm slightly surprised about. For the unconnected guy, the timing of their promotion seems to have no effect on their post performance. That actually I find it, you know, maybe I shouldn't be surprised. It's all random. Maybe you win most of the time anyway. So it's.
Yeah, there's that, right? So the British have the problem that they win all of the time. But it is true, if you look at the unconnected people, then if they had followed a simple merit rule, they would have done much better. So there's some evidence of inefficiency here, because clearly there's a very simple rule of thumb, which just means, you know, you look up how many captures they have. If they'd gone with that, they would have done better. So, you know, we're not trying to say that they get everything perfectly right. We're just looking at this one dimension, and it's very clear that had they ignored the knowledge that they have about the person, they would have done worse. And most of that comes from fast tracking connected people, but some of it comes also from keeping out connected guys who are no good.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
In the remaining 10 minutes, I will select some questions from the audience. Maybe many of these questions are related to Professor Lee's comments. Anyway, so the first one is about the ship fix effect. And he wants to know whether or not this connected guy will get better ships or crews. So it's a kind of a favoritism effect, maybe.
So the ship fixed effects are no better. So we thought in the beginning, a little bit naively, that maybe we can just proxy how good the ship is by looking at something like the number of guns. That's actually not true, because the really boring commands to be given are the really big ships, and nothing ever happens on a really big ship. All the fun is in the frigates. These are the sort of sixth, fifth, fourth rate ships maybe. And once you have 50 guns or up, nothing exciting happens. There's a lot of variation in quality in them. So some of these ships are very good and some of them are very bad. Interestingly, the best ships in the British Navy are all built by the French. The British don't build particularly great ships themselves, but they capture all the good ships from the French, and then those are the crack ships that the good guys get to sail. There's a lot of variation in quality, but the extent to which you as a connected person get them is not particularly great.
Okay, I want to add a question. Whether or not can control for the enemy fix effect, for example, fighting against the French or other countries, is that possible?
Yeah, it's easily possible to control for that. That's in the spirit of Jin Li's comments. I think we should definitely do this. Something that didn't come up, but that's a little bit in the back of our minds. Of course, everything here is a relative statement, right? So the British do well, but then compared to a promotional rule of the main enemy that says if you're not of noble blood, no matter how good you are, you can't be an officer. That's not a very high standard, right? You're going to end up with an awful lot of really bad people if that's how you promote. So it's important to keep in mind that there's quite a bit of fighting, including against the Spanish are no better than the French in terms of selection, but there's also naval battles against the Americans, the Dutch, the Danish, and all of these have much less bias in favor of noble blood, and they have a rich seafaring tradition, large merchant navies, including good sailors. And even in those engagements, the British outfight. So it's not, that the standard of comparison is uniformly just very low.
Yeah, thanks. Well, the next two questions are correlated. One is from Huang Bin. He asks, is there any data that may test whether these leaders promoted with connection were assigned easier tasks such as weaker enemy, different battle region? And I will finish the next. The next is from Professor Cameron Campbell from HKUST. I had a similar thought. Connected officers may have used their influence to secure assignments with greater prospects for action. For what it's worth, I seem to remember in Patrick Aubrey novels, they were constantly scheming to get specific assignments that would offer chances to distinguish themselves. Is that right?
Yeah, so assignment is a big issue, right? And there's basically good jobs and bad jobs like in any organization. And the thing you don't want to do is to be given blockade duty. So the British spend a large part of their time blockading enemy ships in harbor, whether it's Brest or Toulon, and that just means that you sail your ship back and forth day and night, making sure the French don't come up. And there's no joy and no glory in that job. The thing you want is to be given a cruise, okay? So given a cruise is detached service, there's no other ship around, and then you basically hunt on the high seas whether you can find something of the same size or smaller that you can capture, and then you make a lot of money. So is there evidence that the assignments are easier? Not really. So many of these connected officers actually end up in the bigger ships and the ones on blockade duty. Why is that? Because if you are someone and you're connected, then you're asked to serve on the flagship of Admiral so-and-so and so forth. So some of this will be more prestigious, but it's not likely to give you extra captures. And I think the best solution we have to this question is to look at the single ship actions. The single ship actions, basically, because they're entirely random. Java wasn't looking for Constitution, and Constitution wasn't looking for Java. They just happened to run into each other, and the rest is history. That, I think, is a fairly clean way of dealing with it, right? You don't know which number comes up, whether the enemy ship is 50% stronger than you are or not, and then you just see how they fight in that setting.
Well, the next is about the measure or classification of the connections. So given the biographical sources you have, is it possible to distinguish between educational connections, similarities, signaling aspects like the shared school tie, as well as the bloodline, in terms of both patronage and performance?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Connections through bloodline, and what's the alternative?
So the how to distinguish the connections between educational connections, similarities, and the signaling aspects, like a shared school tie.
Yeah, so everything that we use here is genetic, okay? So we have a fairly loose cutoff of 16 degrees of separation. There's no, we were in college together. There's no, my father was part of the same guild as you. It's just whether they're relatives or not. And, we have to be honest, 16 degrees of separation is a lot. There are people out there, 16 degrees of separation from me. I've never heard of them. I don't know who they are. Now, in the 18th century, especially in a society like England, a lot of time and resources go into tracking who you're related to because it's a way to get ahead. People do know who they're related to many, many degrees apart because it's a very useful thing. And there's handbooks like the Bretts that will tell you who's related to whom. A source of great fascination because it's a matter of great use to people at the time.
Okay, maybe the last question. Will there be influence of meritocracy? That is exams. For example, schools are prepared for apprentice seamen or younger ship boys. For them, passing exams for promoting to a higher position of a senior officer can also be a reason. What's more, I don't know if the EIC, East Indian Company, are related to Navy. Will there be also external hiring from the chartered company based on some captain's previous performance?
Okay, great question. So all the training preparing people for the lieutenant's exam is basically informal, done by the captain of the ship. Okay, so the captain will select people just like Morris Suckling selected Horatio Nelson, and then as part of one of their duties is to be taught, and they're taught navigation and all sorts of complex stuff. Is that training going to be better for connected guys? I don't think so. It's not obvious why it would be. The standard of excellence that you have to meet to become a lieutenant is fairly uniform. Okay, if anything, as you saw in the case of Nelson, the bar is a bit lower for the connected guys, which should then mean that some people who have not been trained quite as exquisitely as other lieutenants slip in if they're connected. So if there's any bias, it goes the other way. The question about the East India Company, yes, that's a source of recruitment, but it's mostly for seamen. The East India Company has a lot of ships and a lot of seamen, and the Royal Navy always wants more seamen. And typically they're given exemptions, but not always. And then the press gang gets to work and helps to man that large battleship with 900 men aboard, with some people who are there somewhat involuntarily and won't see their families for the next 5 years.
Okay, time's up. We have to stop here. Many thanks for your fantastic talk and the discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you so much, Professor Lee's comments. And so finally, maybe let Professor Zhiwu Chen give a concluding remark and forecast the next seminar.
Oh, thank you, Chicheng. I have to say, Joachim, this is your paper's results will be very much appreciated by the descendants of the Red revolutionaries in China, because the sitting leader and follow-on leaders are mostly from the third generation of the old revolutionaries. So then they probably should promote.
Look at how well everything works.
Yeah, so they should probably promote your paper and make your paper one of the required readings for all the Communist Party members next year. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. So a week from today, so next Thursday, we'll have our own Professor Guo Qixu, from the University of Hong Kong's History Department. So he's our carry group professor in globalization history. So next week he will talk in English, not in Mandarin. So the English lecture he will give will be on one American, one Chinese, and their extraordinary journeys in the 19th century. He is well known for his many years of work on the U.S.-China diplomatic as well as other relations going back from the very beginning all the way to the 1960s, 70s. So please remember to sign up for this, and it will be exactly 1 week from today. Thank you again for joining this seminar, this webinar. So hope you can come again. And then thank you, Joachim, and thank you, Professor Lee, for doing this. Okay, so goodbye for now.
Thank you.
Yeah.